This is ridiculous. Everyone knows that if Doomsday comes back, I'll just take care of him like last time. Oh no, but you'll die. I wasn't actually dead. Well, kind of. I can't believe I actually work doing this sort of tabloid crap. What's the main story, anyway? What? What? Oh, God damn it, Lois! Okay, I'm gonna have to do the thing again. Okay. Hopefully that took care of it. What's the top headline now? Oh, come on! Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. You know, I think I might actually keep the glasses on for this review. Really adds to the whole nerd aesthetic. Anyway, this week, in order to commemorate the release of the new franchise reboot from James Gunn, I thought it'd be fun to take a look back at the Man of Steel's original silver screen debut. So this week we'll be talking about Superman and the Mole Men from 1951. Starring George Reeves, who, oddly enough, is actually completely unrelated to Christopher Reeve, the next actor to play Superman. It's kind of funny. Anyway, before we get into this movie, I do feel like it's important to bring up the fact that while this is Superman's first feature film, this is not the first live-action depiction of Superman. In fact, about 3 years prior to this movie coming out, there was a 13-part film serial that was released titled Superman, starring Kirk Alyn in the starring role. But as any film nerd could tell you, film serials, while technically feature-length when fully assembled, do not count as feature films since they are distributed in pieces. So, as a result, Superman and the Mole Men does in fact hold the position of being the first Superman feature adaptation. Of course, despite the fact that this movie does hold the status as the original Superman movie, it feels like a lot of people don't really remember it, and that might be because of what this movie was made in service of. So, as mentioned, this movie does star George Reeves in the leading role of Clark Kent, Superman. And following this movie's release, George Reeves went on to star in a 6-season television show called Adventures of Superman that ran from 1952 to 1958. But the reason why George Reeves continued playing this character in that show is because this movie essentially acted as a backdoor pilot to Adventures of Superman. And following the movie's success, it was actually re-edited and split in two as a 2-part pilot for the show. Which, based on the structure of this movie, I strongly suspect was the plan that they had the entire time. But considering that this movie was basically a backdoor pilot, I feel like a lot of people don't remember the movie as much as they remember the show itself. So with that all in mind, you might be asking yourself, okay, if this movie was a backdoor pilot, then what is the feature debut of Superman actually about? Well, when Superman and the Mole Men begins, we actually get narration in front of a backdrop of space explaining to us exactly who Superman is and what his origin is. You know, the fact that he is from the planet Krypton, the fact that he is the sole survivor of the planet's destruction, and the fact that on Earth he represents truth, hope, and the American way. Now, these are all elements that everyone in the modern age knows about Superman. But I actually find it pretty impressive the fact that this movie, which came out in 1951, doesn't really waste the audience's time showing us where Superman came from or, like, why he is what he is. Instead, the movie gives us just a quick 2-3 minute narration explaining who Superman is, and then it just jumps right into the plot. Which I appreciate. You know, it's brevity. But following this narration, we then pivot to an oil well in a city called Silsbee, that's somewhere out in the Midwest. And as we find out throughout the film, this oil well in the town of Silsbee is actually the deepest dug oil well in the world, and goes down 6 miles. Which is actually kind of mind-boggling even now. Like, I'm not sure how many of you know this, but the Earth's crust is only about 19 miles thick. So, a 6-mile deep hole? That's like a third of the way through the Earth's crust. Like, that's pretty deep. Of course, just like any other deep hole, this one is teeming with trouble. As we see that the foreman of this oil operation is actually shutting down the oil well for some mysterious reason. And as he's shutting it down, coincidentally, we have the introduction of our 2 central characters, Clark Kent and Lois Lane, who have actually driven to Silsbee in order to do an article on the oil well for the Daily Planet. And the 2 of them are a bit disappointed to see that the well is getting shut down, but they aren't really given a reason why. Of course, we, the audience, find out exactly the reason why later that night, as we see from a ground door attached to the oil well, 2 little men pop out. 2 little mole men, if you will. Now, throughout the course of the film, these mole men are depicted to be mostly benign creatures. However, despite the fact that they mostly appear to be harmless, their sudden appearance causes the townsfolk to panic. And as this panic ensues, and the public come to learn that these creatures are actually radioactive, a small-town tyrant named Luke Benson ends up forming an angry mob to hunt down these 2 mole men. Of course, once this angry mob forms, that's when the film discards the mild-mannered Clark Kent, and instead introduces us to the Man of Steel. Superman! Okay, I think I'm gonna take the glasses off now. But yes, Superman has come to de-escalate the situation. He's not interested in hurting anyone, he doesn't want to hurt the townsfolk, and he doesn't want to hurt the mole men. He just wants understanding given the situation that everyone is in. Of course, despite Superman's incredible strength, variety of superpowers, authoritative demeanor, and genuine concern for everyone's safety, neither Luke Benson nor the rest of the mob are really taking him seriously or listening to him, as they end up shooting one of the mole men off of a dam and nearly contaminating their own water, and eventually chasing the other mole man to an abandoned shed before burning it to the ground. Now, at this point, Luke Benson and his men feel like they've gotten rid of this quote-unquote menace to their community, but despite believing that they've killed both of these mole men, they've actually killed neither, as the one who got shot off the dam was rescued by Superman and then taken to a local hospital to be treated. Meanwhile, the other one managed to find a way out of the burning shed and retreated back underground. After retreating, this mole man actually brings up 2 other mole men with a futuristic-looking weapon, which, as I found out, was just made out of an old vacuum cleaner, and they go to the hospital to get their friend back. Upon hearing that more mole men have appeared, Luke Benson has become fed up, and he decides to go off on his own to get rid of these little creatures. Of course, the mole men are able to spot Benson before he fires his gun, and at this point, Benson gets a taste of his own medicine as he gets shot by some sort of radioactive ray. Of course, being the defender of justice, Superman not only returns the injured mole man back to his compatriots, but blocks the radiation ray leading to Benson, saving his life. Superman then escorts the mole men back to the oil well, and as the mole men climb back down, they destroy the oil well, sealing the entrance to their underground kingdom. And as the film ends, Lois Lane simply states that the mole men blowing up the oil well is their way of saying that we will live our lives while you live yours. Good observation, Lois. Really, really poignant. Seriously. But yeah, that's the story of Superman and the Mole Men. And, it's okay. Superman and the Mole Men is an okay movie. Like, there's nothing truly exceptional about it, but it's definitely a fun watch. And by the end of the movie, I was left wanting more, and it made me curious to check out, the series that this movie led into. As I genuinely felt like this movie did offer a lot of solid setup for future stories. Like I said at the beginning, I think the fact that this movie doesn't waste its time showing the audience Superman's origin story is actually a positive, and really helps to make the world of this film feel lived in. Like, Superman as a character already exists in this world. He's already a defender of justice. He already represents American values. But there's also subtle instances in this film that show that despite the fact that Superman is a pre-established character in this world, this is still somewhat early in his career. Like when the small town is talking about all the rumors they've heard about Superman, that he can fly, that he can do this, that he can do that. Like, it's very clear that they've heard of him, but they don't necessarily believe everything that they've heard until they actually see it. Which I think is actually a pretty subtle way of communicating exactly where Superman sits in his timeline in this movie. I also really enjoy the special effects that you do see in this movie. Like, it's sparse, but the way they depict Superman's flying effect, or the way that he bends weapons like guns, none of it ever feels cheap or hokey. And I actually found myself really invested watching him use his abilities. And that's coming from someone who's never really been the biggest Superman fan. Like, I don't hate the character, but he's just never really been my thing. But watching Superman in action, it did, at least for a moment, take my brain out of analytical mode and help me to just enjoy what I was watching. It wasn't until after I finished the movie that I realized, oh, okay, the flying effect, that's obviously wires, and him bending guns, they're obviously, like, rubber guns, like they're prop guns. And moving on from Superman's abilities to his character, I think the way his character is depicted in this movie is incredibly consistent with other versions of the Superman character. And I am talking about both personas, the Clark Kent persona and the Superman persona. When appearing as the mild-mannered Clark Kent, Superman comes off as incredibly inquisitive, even-tempered, and reasonable. But as Superman, he's a more authoritative character. He's fair, he'll give people chances, but he won't tolerate active threats of violence. And it's really interesting seeing him in this film as a man with all these abilities, not go out of his way to abuse them. Like, it'd be incredibly easy for Superman to round up every single member of the angry mob and just throw them into the county jail. But he doesn't do that. He does take their guns from them at a certain point, but he only does that when they're proven not to be responsible enough to own them. Because at this point in the story, they're all just so bloodthirsty, and they're just desperate to hunt down the mole men. Which brings me to another point I want to bring up, the fact that I think it's actually an interesting narrative decision that the mole men are not the antagonists of this film. The central antagonist of this film, if there is one, would be Luke Benson, since he is the lead tyrant heading up the angry mob. Like, the mole men are just curious creatures who've discovered this new world above their own. They have really no concept of anything that's going on, and they're just confused the whole time. And I think that the actors that they got to play the mole men, whose names I do not know, I'm sorry, I think they did a really good job embodying that sense of confusion, curiosity, fear, and they never say a word. It's really astounding. And what I think is even more astonishing is the fact that they are portrayed as these kind and curious visitors, rather than these evil invaders. As it's an incredibly refreshing subversion on a common trope that you saw in sci-fi movies at the time. Also, as a side note with the mole men from this movie, they make it clear in the context of the film that the mole men come from a subterranean society that exists within the hollow Earth. So this film sort of reaffirms, like, the now defunct hollow Earth theory, which is a relatively interesting sci-fi framing. But I also just kind of find that funny because in the wider universe of DC Comics, the Earth actually is hollow. Like, there's a subterranean kingdom in DC Comics known as Skartaris that's ruled over by a benevolent warlord named Travis Morgan, who's like a former US, like, Air Force pilot. Which is, it's something. It's something. But yeah, the mole men. They're interesting. They're interesting. Who knows, maybe they're from Skartaris. And yes, I know that Superman was still associated with the Action Comics title, not the DC Comics title, because the publisher had not rebranded to DC yet from Detective Comics. It's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. We're not here to discuss that. Point is, the Mole Men are interesting. They're cool. I like them as a concept. I like the way they're depicted as just these little confused guys. It's fun. Of course, putting all that aside, it's very clear what the highlight of this movie is. The highlight of this movie is George Reeves and his performance as the character of Superman. George Reeves is just so incredibly charming, and very obviously gives the best performance in the movie. And it actually is incredibly astonishing the fact that George Reeves does deliver such a good performance in this film, considering that he didn't actually want to play this character. You see, despite the fact that Superman is probably the role that George Reeves is best remembered for, in reality, the man was actually an incredibly prolific actor, and he starred in so many amazing films throughout his 20s and 30s. I mean, for God's sake, the man even had an incredibly prominent side role in Gone with the Wind. But by the time he got to his mid to late 30s, his star started to fizzle out, so he reluctantly accepted the role of Superman just to have some steady work. And taking that into consideration fills me with an incredible sense of admiration for him and his acting talent, that he chose to do this role, despite not initially wanting to. And based on the one piece of media I've seen from him in this role, I think he did a pretty good job. And all of that really just makes it sadder hearing the way his life ended. Because many of you may not be aware of this, but George Reeves was actually found dead from a gunshot wound in his house in 1959. And while his death was officially ruled as a suicide by the police, there were so many mediating factors and mysterious circumstances surrounding his death that to this day it remains unclear whether or not he actually committed suicide or if he was in fact murdered. There's actually an amazing film that came out in 2006 called Hollywoodland that is all about the investigation surrounding George Reeves' death. And interestingly enough, Ben Affleck plays George Reeves in this movie, and he does a pretty great job. And oddly enough, he looks a lot like George Reeves. Like, a lot. Like, I'll put a side-by-side picture here of the two men. Like, you can tell the differences between them, but they look very similar. And funny enough, Hollywoodland existing makes Ben Affleck technically the only actor alive to have played both Batman and Superman. Yeah, technically he doesn't play Superman directly, he plays an actor who played Superman, but it's still incredibly interesting. It's sort of like how Willem Dafoe is the only actor alive to have played versions of both Dracula and Van Helsing. Because, obviously, the original Nosferatu is a knockoff of Dracula, and Willem Dafoe plays Max Schreck, the actor that played Count Orlok, in a movie called Shadows of a Vampire, which is about making the original Nosferatu. But he also plays Professor von Franz, who is the Van Helsing stand-in in the latest version of Nosferatu from Robert Eggers. It's a lot. It's a lot. But in any case, George Reeves was an incredible actor. He's amazing in this movie. And his death is not only tragic, but just another instance of the prolonged Superman curse, which somehow exists. Like, this is really just an odd piece of trivia that exists amongst film nerds, but there is sort of a curse associated with the Superman role that's affected pretty much every actor that's ever played the character. Like, I've already talked about what happened to George Reeves, but the actor that played Superman before George Reeves, Kirk Allen, ended up having his career destroyed by the role of Superman. He was typecasted as that character, and the last notable role he had, prior to dying of Alzheimer's, was as Lois Lane's father in Superman 78. Aside from that, he really just spent the rest of his career doing commercials, small voice roles, and uncredited screen roles. There was also Lee Quigley, who was the baby that played Superman in Superman 78. He died at the age of 14 of drug abuse. Then there was obviously Christopher Reeve, who played Superman in Superman 78, and he ended up getting paralyzed from the neck down after falling off of a horse, and then he died less than a decade later of heart failure. And of course now we have Henry Cavill, who played Superman in the now defunct DCEU, and following that role, his career has just been nothing but failures after failures, despite the fact that he's a genuinely talented actor who has an outstanding physicality. It's weird. It's just weird. So with that all in mind, let's hope that David Cornsweet, who's taking on the role now, has a much, much better life than the rest of these men. Because it just sucks. It all sucks. It's terrible that is just a thing that exists. It's kind of similar to, like, the Darth Vader curse in Star Wars, where, like, pretty much every actor that's played Darth Vader / Anakin Skywalker, aside from James Earl Jones, has just had their life ruined. Like, David Prowse, who was the original stunt actor for Darth Vader, ended up having a falling out with George Lucas, which resulted in him getting blacklisted and banned from pretty much every officially sponsored Lucasfilm event. Then there's Jake Lloyd, obviously, who played the young Anakin in The Phantom Menace, who was horribly bullied at school and later got diagnosed with schizophrenia. And then there was Hayden Christensen, who got relentlessly criticized for his role as Anakin Skywalker in the prequels and ended up having to just take on smaller acting roles for a decade before coming back relatively recently to, like, mainstream films. It's a lot. But back to Superman. So I've already discussed the positives with this movie, but while I like it and think it does a lot of interesting things, it does have some significant drawbacks. Like I've mentioned already, this movie was basically a backdoor pilot to a TV show, and that is very noticeable. Like, while I found the narrative to be mostly engaging, it was incredibly slow-paced, and overall didn't really come off as a tight 3-act story. It instead more came off as, like, an extended 5-act sitcom pilot, as so many of the scenes are just cut in real time, and you just see people running back and forth. And like I mentioned, the later series Adventures of Superman was a kids show, and the moral that this film tries to communicate through its theme is incredibly blunt, and basically just amounts to accepting others for their differences. Like I said, I do really enjoy the Mole Men's inclusion in this film, and I like the fact that they're not awkwardly framed as the antagonists, because that would just be incredibly played out. But the fact that Superman in the movie has to constantly reiterate that no one is thinking straight, and he has to remind people not to panic, and that he even goes as far as comparing the angry mob to literal Nazi stormtroopers, it's just incredibly blunt. Like, I can appreciate a message that's preaching tolerance, but it just kind of beats you over the head. And I understand that this is a moral more meant for kids, but the fact that it is a moral that's meant for kids doesn't excuse it from being subtle. There's plenty of great pieces of kids' media out there that have very subtle themes and morals that are communicated throughout the course of an episode. Like Avatar: The Last Airbender, for instance. And this just doesn't come off the same way. And it's also kind of weird, because based on the setup of the film and how it's presented, it almost feels like sort of a bad episode of The Outer Limits, or The Twilight Zone. Because you have this vague sci-fi premise of little men who live in the hollow earth, and they come up, and they get confused wandering around, and then the normal people start freaking out and chasing them, but the ultimate moral is that the average people are the bad guys and not the little people that came up underground. Like, it legitimately feels like a Twilight Zone or Outer Limits premise, but they just put Superman in it. And unfortunately, while the themes of tolerance and the criticisms of the mob mentality and the allegory surrounding the Red Scare are interesting, this movie certainly isn't The Monsters Come to Maple Street. I'm sorry, it's just not. Like, at the end of the day, it's just a stretched out TV episode with mostly wooden acting. Like I said, George Reeves is amazing. I think he's incredibly charming as Superman. And I also think that Walter Reed, who plays the mine foreman in this movie, is also surprisingly good. Like, he's a prevalent side character, but he's by no means the focus of the movie. He doesn't need to put in that much work, and he does. It's kind of interesting. Everyone else, though, they're all just the stock generic side character that you would see in, like, every movie and show that came out during this era. And they all speak with that weird, fake, fast-talking East Coast accent. You know the one, where it's all like, "The year is 1951, and while the Jerrys have been defeated, the Western world is still ripe with intolerance, because blah 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 blah." Like, this movie was made during, like, the tail end of that particular acting trend. And, it's not great. It's entertaining, there's a nostalgic quality to that, but I'm really glad that we sort of left that style of acting behind, and that it's more relegated to satire now. Because even at the time, it felt silly. And like I said, most of the characters do it. Even Lois, to a lesser extent, and it feels awkward that she's kind of barely in this movie. Like, she's the main love interest for Superman, obviously. And Phyllis Coates, I think she does a fine job as Lois Lane, but I don't feel like there's enough of her in the film to really get a proper gauge of her character. And for a lot of the runtime, it just kind of feels like she's the nagging wife. And also, I know that it's part of the core concept of Superman, and this isn't necessarily a problem that is isolated to this particular film, but it's so frustrating, the fact that Lois Lane never realizes that Clark Kent is Superman. Like, that is just so unbelievably frustrating in every single piece of Superman media that exists. And there's so many instances in this movie where Lois is like, oh my god, Kent, where did you go? You just ran away and Superman showed up. And I just kept chuckling to myself whenever that happened, because I'm like, really? Really? And I would give it a pass for this film, because this is the first Superman movie, if it weren't for the fact that this movie doesn't take place in Metropolis. This movie takes place in, like, the Midwest, when Clark Kent and Lois Lane are, like, by themselves. And she doesn't question once, like, why Superman just happened to show up from Metropolis. It's just so stupid. It's just so stupid, and I hope that James Gunn has the good sense to not do that in his version of Superman. But, in any case, despite my criticisms, I like this movie. I like Superman and the Mole Men. I think that this is an incredibly quaint film. It's very cozy. I think that they overall nail the character of Superman. And I also think that the ending of the film is genuinely great. Like, seriously, I was locked in at the end of the movie, because you have that scene where Superman rescues Luke Benson from, like, the radiation beam, which is a vacuum cleaner. And after he saves Benson, Benson just says to Superman, oh, you saved my life. And Superman responds,
that's more than you deserve.
And that's just such a cold line. And it's not only wonderfully performed by George Reeves, but also cuts deep into this character of Luke Benson. Because, yeah, he's been a bloodthirsty maniac throughout the entire movie, just attacking these creatures. And the fact that Superman saved his life is more than he deserved. But Superman says it himself earlier in the movie, that the Mole Men have just as much of a right to live as Benson does. And Superman, being a principled character who practices what he preaches, isn't going to be a hypocrite about the situation. He's going to do his best to protect everyone, regardless of the circumstances. And by the end, despite the Mole Men shooting that ray, he still escorts them home kindly, because he understands that the only reason they attacked is because they felt threatened. And then the Mole Men, recognizing the danger inherent to them in this world unfamiliar to them, elect to cut themselves off. They isolate themselves from the rest of the world because they understand that the rest of the world is not welcoming to them. It's an incredibly powerful conclusion to this film. And by the end of it, I was like, wow, that was a good experience. I didn't feel like I wasted my time watching the movie. So, if nothing else, you can at least say that Superman's first movie has an amazing conclusion. Which, at the end of the day, that's all you can really ask for. But, in any case, that was my review of Superman and the Mole Men. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram or Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes. Please do not spoil the new Superman movie in the comments. I'm actually interested in seeing it. And, I will see you all later. Whew. God. Once again, so constricted. Why do I keep doing this to myself? Okay. Whew. God. Oh God, I look like a mess. Anyway, back in color. I'm not in color for no reason this time, though. The reason I'm in color is because it's raffle time! Woo! So cringe. So, as many of you may or may not know, I'm doing a cumulative raffle for when I reach my first 500 subscribers. Basically, every few videos, I include a new piece of merchandise into a pot, which will slowly grow over time, and once I reach my first 500 subscribers, I'm going to give that pot away to a lucky winner. So this week, in order to celebrate Superman, I'll be including this Superman shield patch in my raffle. Obviously, it's the classic Superman shield logo. it's just the regular logo. Like, it isn't as flashy as, like, this Superman Action Comics patch that I have in my jacket. But, you know, if you would like this patch as well as the other pieces of merchandise that have accumulated in my pot so far, all you have to do is subscribe and comment under this video to be entered. I will be selecting a winner once I reach my first 500 subscribers. So, best of luck to you all.